We take for granted that space is a futuristic concern. It's cutting-edge technology, aesthetics, and questions about life forms that we can experience today. But what kind of a future for humanity do today's space visions contain? As a historian of experimental practices in architecture and art, I would like to posit today that today's dominant visions of human space civilizations are somewhat retrograde. They, I will show, uphold 1950s ideas of pastoral suburban life at a time when this model is no longer sustainable on Earth. If life in space was once a form of techno-utopia for a futuristic society, today it serves as a nostalgic promise to perpetuate a decomposing American dream, an escape hatch. And I'll elaborate on the history and present state of these visions and point to possible alternatives.
Dialogue box that acrobats. It said that it closed.
Error. Access denied.
That little dialogue box said that Adobe Acrobat that's closed.
Thank you. So, coming of age during the Cold War, American models for space society reflected the social, political, and economical ideologies of 1950 suburbia. This makes sense, given that the pursuit of space was a race, as Kenneth Osgood writes, between the hard power of Soviet communism, and here we see the Soviet aerospace infrastructure on display in New York, and the soft power of Western capitalism. This is a video installation that screened glimpses of Americans' daily lives by Ray and Charles Eames in a geodesic dome in the American Pavilion in Moscow designed by Buckminster Fuller. Both exhibitions took place in the summer of 1959. Perhaps the most famous from that American exhibition are images of the Sputnik and the famous kitchen debate between Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and U.S. then Vice President Richard Nixon, which historian Greg Castillo has called the most unusual call to arms in diplomatic history. If the Soviets were going to be first in space, we would at least make sure that everyone could watch on their new family television. And here is a Roomba, already in 1959, in a house that manifested popular American fantasies of life in outer space, like in the Jetsons. Once NASA was established in 1958, studies of lunar settlements gained momentum. Can I close this? In 1959, the engineer Rudolf Szilard and Dr. James Gohm in the U.S. developed a prototype for a lunar habitat, a closed-loop environment for the Martin Company, a NASA contractor. Models and images like this circulated in trade publications and industry conferences. But they were popularized through images like the one on the right, which transformed them into habitable worlds of leisure in space. For example, this one features a country club atmosphere with always athletic facilities. And the subtext of these images, which were disseminated worldwide, was that American comforts and lifestyles were suited to life everywhere, even in outer space. The modern suburb then provided a visual model for space while obscuring the political economic paradigm that generated it. NASA administrators understood that for the public to buy into human space exploration, it needed to connect to Americans' needs or aspirations. Illustrations by a genre of artists, some trained in landscape painting and others in architecture, helped to humanize life support infrastructures that actually looked like these. If the reality of what it took to survive space was to appeal to 1960s Americans, it needed to demonstrate a relatable goal. And this is a quote from the 1968 Convention of Geophysicists in DC, where he says, "The public won't buy science for science's sake, so sell it to them for their own sake." And the emphasis is actually in the original document in the archives here. So in the NASA archives, images like this often accompany the technical drawings well into the 1980s. This is how NASA kind of communicated the idea of life through the mechanics of what the engineers were doing. Following the 1969 lunar landing, interest in habitability grew at NASA on two fronts. For one, potentially longer stays in orbit would benefit from better understanding of how humans adapt psychologically to closed-loop environments. Secondly, public enthusiasm for NASA research fell sharply after the initial lunar landing, and the agency needed to kind of confirm its commitment to public utility. And habitability was a key area of potential value to American communities. In summer of 1970, the agency sponsored the second mission in Tektite, which we see here, in undersea habitat that studied groups of aquanauts for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. Ed Wertz, an experimental psychologist, was a key researcher on that project. In parallel, he was also organizing a symposium on habitability in May of 1970. Rather than organize it in the climate-controlled ballrooms of a hotel, he had his friend, the Los Angeles light artist Robert Irwin, host the symposium in Irwin's studio. Participants included space scientists as well as planners, sociologists, artists, and other humanists. Irwin, the architect Frank Gehry, and another artist Larry Bell turned the studio into an evolving environment that would play a role in the symposium. They made the room too dark, as you see here, uncomfortable. They broke a hole in the wall as an entrance. They made the rooms too echoey. Sometimes the sound became too dampened. They had people sit awkwardly on a busy curb because they removed the chairs, so they had to eat lunch outside. They made the environment, in other words, an active participant, so that the discussion of habitability in a hostile environment wouldn't be entirely abstract. In Irwin's accounts of the event, the participants grinned and bore it, without actually consciously realizing that the discomforts of the spaces had been manufactured. So habitability provided one way for NASA to claim social benefits as the agency faced mounting pressure and budgetary cuts in the early 70s. Living in space was still a pipe dream, and the public needed something more immediate to justify the upcoming shuttle program. But also, like the surplus manufacturing capacity after the war, the surplus technological intelligence required a new market after the space race. Could out-of-work aeronautical engineers become urbanists? This is documentation from one city program to facilitate technology transfer from aerospace and the military for Los Angeles in 1973. And the Habitability Symposium that happened in LA too was part of those efforts, and hence this interdisciplinary group. And ultimately, from those Tektite missions and the symposium, Wertz and his team developed the following factors as key for habitability in contained environments. And these, unsurprisingly, reflect distinctly American values, our personal freedoms to fulfill our greatest destinies, and a sense of individualism and exceptionalism. So individuality, sense of purpose, and sense of choice. The question of habitability seems to have belied a particular ideology, which at mid-century was spatialized through the model of suburban development. And my question that I'm just beginning to research is, how would these ideas of habitability look if Soviets had run the tests? In a paper addressing the 1950s growth of Orange County, which abuts Los Angeles, due to aerospace industries, historian of science Stuart Leslie details the mid-century modern homes, elementary schools, and upper-middle-class amenities that accompanied the arrival of scientists and executives. Parking lots lined the aerospace campuses to accommodate private vehicles, and people working on space were themselves immersed in the suburban world. In comparison, the Soviet aerospace engineers that Stuart describes inhabited communal apartment blocks within walking distance to their offices and labs. And visions for space colonies continued their unfettered embrace of suburban ideals into the 1970s. In 1975, Princeton physicist Gerard O'Neill conducted the landmark NASA summer study that we're all familiar with between Stanford and NASA's Ames Research Center on the feasibility of permanent, large-scale human space habitats. He, as we know, was a proponent of orbiting settlements and was influential to Bezos, who attended his classes. During that summer session, the group worked out 3 options for space colony typologies for 10,000 residents. This was the most favored one, the Stanford Taurus. But this is what it looked like inside. A residential suburban typology with patios and skylights, so that there was no need to adjust our normative frameworks of the good life for inhabiting space. This is one of roughly 13 images painted by Rick Guidis and Don Davis for the summer study. They remain some of the most famous and iconic representations of space habitats to this day. This is another view inside. We see a lush landscape with familiar natural features dotted with homes and a sunken shopping center right in the front of the center. And here's one from another typology, the Bernal Sphere. And note the juxtaposition of the techno-scientific horizon with the profoundly aspirational scene below. An outdoor cocktail party, complete with a waiter, Above looms the infrastructure of an orbital cylinder, and there's a hang glider on the top left there that underscores the variable gravity in the extraplanetary setting. O'Neill published a book summarizing the research in 1977, just came out. He opened it with a fictional letter from a colony resident narrating an idyllic, comfortable, and familiar life in space. The governance model that he espoused was a sort of technocratic corporatism, centralized corporate oversight with local autonomy for each colony. The emphasis is on comfort and leisure for a workforce that supports energy manufacturing and industrial mining. It details a fully managed nature, from agriculture to forest, and a lifestyle of easy pleasure and fulfilling work. O'Neill's protagonists claimed that, quote, we could build space communities with a total land area 3,000 times that of Earth. Now we have to remember that this is following the 1972 publication, The Limits to Growth, when designers and scientists worldwide became alarmed by Earth's dwindling ability to meet the needs of its exploding population. Rather than transform our lifestyles and resource use, O'Neill's answer was that we could simply generate more space and material off-world. But O'Neill's vision was not the only speculative response to 1970s alarm over Earth's environment and rising pollution levels. While he promoted closed worlds inside a fully managed system, maturing, once countercultural artists and architects were envisioning ways of living that more closely engaged with the planet's human and non-human entities. For example, a project by the architectural collective Ant Farm, Dolphin Embassy, envisioned an interspecies flotilla laboratory in international waters where humans and dolphins might communicate and study each other using newly available sensors, cameras, and other technologies. Eventually, ant farmer Doug Michaels combined the two. His project Blue Star, which he worked on as a fellow at Harvard among other places, proposed a human dolphin space station comprised of a 250-foot diameter sphere of water surrounded by an orbiting torus. So compared to this, O'Neill's vision for living off Earth appears really conservative, traditional. But O'Neill's space studies and their visual artifacts have had a lasting impact on our capacity to envision future possibilities of human habitation, whether in space or on Earth. This is another image from that summer study. Today, climate change demands that we rethink idealized models of habitability on Earth, but this remains our primary imaginary of life in space. So take a mental snapshot of this image, because in 2019, it received some mild updates before Bezos' Blue Origin recommitted to this vision in an image in which rapid rail traverses a landscape that shifts from rural, complete with an iconic red barn and again athletic fields, through the suburb to a skyscraper-filled downtown. Has space become the nostalgic repository to preserve a traditional way of life in perpetuity within a fully enclosed and predictable world? Here, the space colony becomes a time capsule for this imaginary that no longer seems to fit on Earth. Even more recently, just this year in 2026, the Aurelia Institute, a group born of the MIT Media Lab that is equally dedicated to space technology and culture, ran a space settlements competition. It too situated itself in reference to O'Neill's summer study. And you see that, it's tiny, but you see the image that I showed you and that they're referencing the official document from the space settlement study. So this is not to critique Aurelia. I think their prize is wonderful, the group is wonderful, and in fact I made all of my students enter the space settlements competition. But it points to the fact that O'Neill's 50-year-old vision remains entrenched in our ideas of a future society in space. And another proponent, as we've heard through the day today, is Zubrin, and the idea that Mars, rather than orbital settlements, is the next frontier. And he, in turn, has inspired Musk with the idea that essentially we should create a global warming effect on purpose until we thicken Mars's atmosphere enough to inhabit it. And there are many, obviously, reasons that this is impossible, but just the idea that we haven't managed to build an off button into global warming on Earth, so we could end up with 2 exhausted planets if we tried to do this again. So as I see it, one problem of habitability on Earth is that the carbon-dependent extractive register of our imaginary of the good life has remained unchanged. And the question that I'm hoping to put on the table today is how the tacit acceptance of these models or imaginaries for space inform our view of habitability on a more bleak Earth. Can space colonies provide the critical distancing that Thomas More's island of Utopia once offered, a limit attitude or a horizon toward which we aspire? As it stands, religious scholar M.J. Rubenstein critiques the visions of Musk or Bezos as perpetuating a Christian model of salvation, now through exploitation of space. Can we do better? And some scholars are bringing the conversation about the ethics of social practices in space environments to civic discourse, a promising exercise in the imagination of alternative possibilities on Earth. For example, unless we're willing to throw people out of the space colony, jail is a costly way to address transgressions in space. And as Erica has shared, she is examining how models of restorative justice, a rare but proven model, might operate in the context of space. Can demonstrating its utility and public benefit in an off-Earth environment support efforts to hinder the American prison industrial complex? Another interesting model is growing scholarship on the planetary, and in particular this call for community input when developing anti-colonial planetary protection policies. How can we bring the conversation of exploring space to the neighborhood level as a way to exercise the imagination of alternative possibilities on Earth? To summarize, my goal today as a historian of architecture was to alert us how outdated our social models for space futures have become. These past models are tethered to extractive colonizing logics, and we need to break with them to reimagine habitability not only in space but on Earth. Space then provides a key utopian horizon through which we might experiment with new imaginaries for life on our planet that we can then work backwards to adapt.